Hi everyone, welcome back to World Civilizations 2, the world since 1500. I am Andrew Ross for the last time before you on this video lecture series. An announcement regarding that, in fact, and we will send out an email, but if you're a go-getter watching this video this weekend, know that this will be the last lecture of the semester and that you should spend next week getting ready for your final exam, which will be available Thursday. May 3rd. May 3rd. Look out for an email for more details. Okay, today we continue our study of globalization, essentially where Dr. Haynes left off. We want, as we proceed today, to keep in mind what Dr. Haynes emphasized last time about the relationship between globalization and the emergence of the ideology of neoliberalism and the emergence of an economically integrated world system under global capitalism. In some ways illustrated by this image of all the different places that go into making your cup of Starbucks coffee, and on the other side, the spread of McDonald's globally. And in fact, if you're curious, I did my dissertation research in France, and the American corporation McDonald's is actually the largest private employer in the country of France. There is, however, another important way of understanding globalization that is linked to the economic emphasis of Dr. Haynes, but not precisely the same thing. And that's going to be the topic of my lecture today, through the example of the Middle East. And indeed, in some ways, what I'm offering today is a broader definition of globalization. I want to argue today that globalization means integration. That globalization implies a vast array of ways in which the globe becomes integrated together. Where events, in particular today, I'm going to talk about events in one place of the world, impact the rest of the world in often unexpected ways. That globalization is not simply or not exclusively economic exchange, it is also cultural exchange, it is religious exchange, it is migration, human migration, in ways that cross over national boundaries in ways that did not occur before. Globalization, in this sense, is not the same as internationalization, because internationalization would imply that this is about competing nation states. Globalization, rather, is about the various ways world events, world trends, world ideologies impact one another across national boundaries. And one theme of my lecture using the Middle East is going to be the tension between the interests of nation states, say Israel or Iran or even Afghanistan, have major effects, major impacts on the rest of the globe. And I'll try to bring us all the way up to the present by emphasizing the ways in which the conflicts of this particular region of the world, the modern Middle East, have immense consequences for our lives here in the United States and for others worldwide. An essential component of my argument will be that the Middle East, after World War II, becomes especially significant to the competing superpowers of the Cold War because of what the Middle East has that everyone else wants: oil. That the politics of the Middle East failed to be localized there in large measure because competing state interests after World War II desire the natural resources that are located there and decide to use the Middle East in various ways to get that natural resource. And so globalization in this regard implies the ramifications of modernization that cross individual state boundaries. The politics of oil, I argue, illustrate the ways in which globalization and its processes removed the possibility of local conflicts remaining local. So, as I said at the very beginning, the event, a war, say, that occurs between two relatively tiny states here in the Middle East will have global ramifications. Global ramifications. So I begin my lecture, perhaps unsurprisingly, with the creation of the State of Israel and the emergence of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, a key flashpoint in the larger conflict between both the superpowers during the Cold War and more broadly between the US and the various actors, both state-based and non-state-based, that define the modern world. Israel is now the Jewish state, or a Jewish state, perhaps better said. And it was designated as such in the late 19th century by the emergence of a Jewish nationalism known as Zionism. The Jewish people prior to World War I or in the 19th century were a diasporic people, right? Living throughout the world without a singular nation state to call a homeland. With the rise of anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe in particular, both in East and in West, gave rise to a new form of nationalism amongst diasporic Jews known as Zionism, which claimed to this area of the Middle East as their historic homeland, with Jerusalem as the capital. During World War I, the British controlled this area, then known as Palestine. And in order to encourage various revolts against the, after World War I, the British will control this area known as Palestine. Before World War I, it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. In order to foment discontent, rebellion within this area of the Ottoman Empire, the British essentially promised to deal with this. The British laid out a promise during World War I in order to encourage revolts against the Ottomans by promising both self-rule by the Palestinians who lived in the territory and the Jews who saw it as their historic homeland, in what is known as the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Already in the early 20th century then, this region was being dragged or torn apart by competing claims. The Palestinians on the one hand who lived here, about 1.2 million of them before World War II, versus about 600,000 Jewish settlers who believed that they had a historic claim to the land as their future nation state. These contradictory promises before World War II led to violence between these two people, the Palestinians and the Jews. During World War II, the British tried to prevent greater and greater immigration of Jews to Palestine in order to keep the territory under control. However, due to the effects of the Holocaust, most notably, but also rising anti-Semitism before the Holocaust, increasing numbers of Jews fled Europe, not only to friendly Western powers such as the United States and Great Britain, but also here to Palestine. By the end of the war, as the crimes of the Nazis came out with increasing fervor, the claims of these increasing numbers of Jewish settlers in the land of Palestine, became more difficult to ignore. And after World War II, a war breaks out between Jewish settlers, Jewish immigrants, and Palestinians who were already living there. These conflicts are really complex, but it is important to recognize what has happened. The crimes of the Holocaust were used to justify a conflict by incoming immigrants of Jewish refugees to essentially make claims over a territory already inhabited by Palestinians. The Zionist phrase, and hopefully I can say it right the first time, it usually takes a couple of goes, a land without a people for a people without a land, the Jews. But that wasn't actually the case. This was a land with a people, the Palestinians. And that is not to say that the claims of the Jewish settlers were not legitimate. There were great historic reasons to justify the creation of a Jewish state. The question is, how would it come about and where would it occur? After World War II, a weakened British Empire could no longer determine that course of action. And instead it would be the Jewish settlers and the Arab Palestinians to make it for them. Following World War II, the British ceded the area of Palestine to the United Nations, which in the aftermath of the Holocaust decided to partition the land of Israel, let me go back to my map actually, into two countries. Israel on the one hand, Palestine on the other. Both sides essentially turned down the offer. For Jews, they want the whole thing, and Palestinians want the whole thing. And war breaks out between the two sides, culminating on May 14th, 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel. The future Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, would later recount the event by saying, quote, "The dream had come true, but too late to save those who had perished in the Holocaust." The new state had opened its borders to Jewish immigrants from all parts of the world, of the diaspora, which created the urge to expand this tiny state in the Middle East, which itself simply exacerbated the existing conflict with its Arab neighbors and the displaced Palestinians. And indeed, the process of the creation of Israel can legitimately be termed a process of ethnic cleansing of the existing Arab populations, pushing the Palestinians who lived in the territory to neighboring states of Egypt and Jordan in particular. And Jordan continues to house a large number of Palestinians in refugee camps. A series of wars throughout the 1960s start to settle down by the late 1970s, and it looks like peace might actually come to Israel. However, hopes for lasting peace could not be established due to the competing claims of the Israelis and the Palestinians, leading to polarization on both sides. In Israel, maximal claims to territorial integrity reject the competing claims of Palestinian desire to return home. And ultimately, neither of these claims can be fully granted if peace within two states are to be secured. It's worth, just as an aside, in the past couple days, a series of protests over here in the Gaza Strip, still occupied by Israel, have been organized by Palestinians demanding the right of return, right? The right of Palestinians forced out of their homes during the process of the creation of Israel. And these unarmed protesters were fired upon by the Israeli military, killing, I think we're probably up to a couple dozen by now, including at least one journalist. This cycle of violence, as you well know, on the basis of that issue, that current event, is ongoing. And quite frankly, it is hard to see, especially with the current state of Israeli politics, how it will end. These struggles are important in their own right, and the human rights issues that they raise are significant and deserve attention. However, they only become globalized, they only become important to the outside superpowers because of something else, and that's oil. That the Middle East was the world's largest reservoir of oil. And the interest of the United States to support the State of Israel, to have a secure ally in the Middle East, in the 1960s in particular, we lay largely at the feet of the existence of these oil reservoirs, that the Western powers wanted access to them. And that desire for access snowballs into a series of events that I'm going to now go on to discuss. The consumer boom of the post-war years in Western Europe and America led to a vastly greater importance of oil to the world economy. After World War II, private Western companies conducted diplomacy with their own governments and those of the Middle East in order to receive concessions for drilling, refining, and shipping oil out of the Middle East and back home. The long-term economic value of Middle Eastern oil reserves made oil a fundamental tool in struggles of power in the region. So, for example, in the wake of a war, the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, the largely Middle Eastern and Arab Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries launched an embargo against Western powers for supporting the side of Israel, demonstrating the ways in which the control of the strategic reserve of a natural resource in one region of the world has wide-ranging effects by driving up the price of gas to astronomical prices and creating large-scale shortages that affect not simply states, but individual consumers within those states. That the OPEC oil embargo of 1973, note in direct response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, illustrates quite clearly the global ramifications of these conflicts. In response to this demonstration of power by the oil-producing Arab countries of the Middle East, Western governments essentially begin to treat the region as a center of gravity of their strategic interests and becomes the subject of great power diplomacy beginning in the 1950s, continuing in the 1950s, accelerating in the 1960s and 70s, and really continuing until today. However, it is worth pointing out that this is changing today. Let me go back to my chart. This chart is probably out of date. The discovery of new technologies allowing for widespread shale drilling in the United States has vastly increased the ability of the U.S. in particular to produce its own oil, and has largely detached the precise strategic needs of the U.S. that existed in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and really even early aughts. This is one reason why we witnessed the Obama administration detach itself to some extent from Saudi Arabia, which used to be so important to the maintenance of U.S. oil supplies, really until 2008, 2010. Obviously, we're seeing a kind of re-engagement with Saudi Arabia, and it's not to say the Obama administration didn't engage with Saudi Arabia, but it didn't see the need to be as close to them, considering all their human rights abuses, as, say, the Bush and Clinton administrations had before them. Why? Because the politics of oil are quite different today than they were during the 1970s. The oil boom, however, did not just provide the basis for global conflicts revolving around the region of the Middle East. It also created the fuel for later forms of conflict that we only came that's not unfair. It also provided the fuel for later conflicts that had global ramifications. And here I particularly think of the rise of political Islam, otherwise known as radical Islam, and global terrorism. The oil boom was important for the Middle East not simply because it demonstrated its strategic significance and power vis-a-vis the West, but because the wealth it generated provided the social conditions in the Middle East itself that contributed to the internal conflicts that gave rise to radical or political Islam. So let me pause for a second before I continue with my story to simply say that yes, there is such a thing as radical Islam. There is such a thing as political Islam, as it was often called prior to 9/11. And Islam as a religion has something to do with that. That there are interpretations of Islam that give credence to and legitimacy to certain people's interpretation. That is not to say, and what I am not arguing in this lecture, is that all of Islam, or even most Islam, actually especially most Islam, has anything to do with its radical interpretation. To make a claim otherwise would be to blame all Christians when someone bombs an abortion clinic, to blame all Jews when a settler in Israel kills a Palestinian, to blame all Hindus when a riot burns a mosque in India. So what I am not about to argue is that Islam is in any way different from any other religion. Rather, I'm going to make the claim that the inequalities that emerged in the wake of the oil boom fed into a radical interpretation of Islam that justified the acts of violence with which I will conclude my lecture. Okay? That is really important, that as historians we do not generalize. We look at the root causes and we look at what drives people to make certain interpretations without assuming that everyone of a particular group necessarily shares that interpretation. The story, I will begin my story of the rise of political or radical Islam in Egypt. Egypt gained nominal independence after World War I, though the British maintained control over this extremely important water passage, the Suez Canal, owned by a British-run country. By the early 1950s in Egypt, a form of kind of secular nationalism emerged that began to challenge the continuing British presence in North Africa. And if anyone has watched the Netflix show, The Crown, you can kind of actually see some of these politics on the screen that are actually quite interestingly represented in the show. Let's see here. Egyptians were also quite outraged at the creation of the State of Israel, that they did not believe in its legitimacy, and indeed were one of the primary adversaries of Israel until the early, until the late 1970s. In 1952, a military figure named General Gamal Abdel Nasser took advantage of this kind of combination of a local nationalism and a kind of fury over the State of Israel to seize power in Egypt, on a platform of economic modernization and national independence. That he claimed that he would harness the power of Egyptian nationalism to modernize the country and fight off the continuing neo-colonial presence of Great Britain. So, in 1954, Nasser is successful at getting the British to withdraw their control over the Suez Canal, but then in 1956, Nasser nationalizes the canal and becomes a hero to Arabs throughout the region. In response, and this response doesn't go so well, as if you watch the show, you will see, Britain, Israel, and France launch a secret plan to attack Egypt and take control of the canal back from Egypt, but the United States was unwilling to support the move. The USSR was also not exactly happy, and the British, French, and Israelis were forced to back down. And Nasser emerges as a hero to both Egyptians and Arabs everywhere for his defiance of the West and his successful wresting of control of the Suez Canal. However, although Nasser's kind of project of nationalism and modernization continue apace, the benefits of this modernization and nationalism were not broadly shared within Egypt. Nor were they broadly shared anywhere in the Middle East, and Egypt in some ways simply proves to be my example. And so disappointment by the 1960s quickly overcomes the pride at being a successful Arab nation who had fought off Western colonialists. And disappointment fed into radical critique. And it's in Egypt that this radical critique first emerges. Beginning in the 1960s, academics and cultural critics in Egypt began to accuse Nasser's regime of being essentially Western. That his modernizing impulses were evidence of the fact that he was tainted by Western ideology. And the reason why Egyptians weren't sharing and benefiting from the wealth that was being generated was evidence of continued Western corruption. And the most important of the theorists who laid out these ideas was an Egyptian here in jailed by Nasser, Said Qutb, who argued that Islam itself had been corrupted from outside influences, and the only solution to fixing the problems that faced both Egypt specifically and the broader Middle East was the total rejection not simply of colonial state power, but colonial and Western ideology writ large. They opposed, in other words, men like Said Qutb, both the colonial power of Western states, but also the political and cultural ideas that they brought with them. Qutb, in other words, is the theorist who gave the ideology of radical Islam a kind of popularized veneer. He's the one who gave the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Iranian revolutionary, actually that's too broad a brush, the Ayatollah of the Iranian Revolution, and most importantly perhaps, or most significantly for us, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, their ideas. The notion that one must fully reject the West in order to purify Islam, and by doing so purify one's society, emerges as a driving force within Middle Eastern politics. And this is significant because these ideas provide the kind of core binding a series of local nationalisms together in ways that other critics of these regimes, secular or moderate, were unable to really do. And that problem is best illustrated by the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And indeed, in some ways, it's quite surprising that the first kind of imposition of radical Islam, of political Islam, in a state occurs in Iran, rather than, say, in Egypt or elsewhere. But it does occur first in Iran, and that's for a number of reasons. And it's worth pausing a bit on Iran, because Iran, once again, is in the news. We'll see where we go. I guess in 2 weeks, we'll find out where we stand vis-a-vis Iran. So, Iran's modernization was kind of the poster child of the various kinds of corruption that could take place in the Middle East. Despite incredible economic growth after World War II, Iranian people suffered greatly in the post-war era. They suffered primarily for two reasons. One, they suffered socially and economically, and let's just combine them, because the wealth that was being generated in Iran was not being broadly shared. Instead, it was being controlled by, second reason they suffered, the Western-friendly autocrat, the Shah, who was installed in 1953 by military coup promoted by the CIA. So Iranians in the post-World War II era were essentially being subjugated by a Western-backed dictator who kept all the proceeds of the oil boom to himself. And indeed, in exchange for cheap oil, and maintaining a kind of friendly government towards the West, the United States and its allies turned a blind eye, actually kind of even more actively supported the existence of an incredibly brutal and repressive regime. This is one of the examples that if we ask about Cold War politics and you want to draw from this lecture, you can apply it to what Dr. Haynes told you about the willingness of the United States and its so-called democratic allies to actively support anti-democratic forces so long as they were capitalist. His rule ended 25 years after he was installed by the CIA in 1979 with a revolution. An economic downturn combined with public unrest, an illness of the Shah, to lead to his retirement. He flees, actually, he dies in the United States, from what if I'm remembering correctly. For about 8 months, there's a great deal of uncertainty. People are in the streets, and in the streets are a whole wide range of people. Iran is an incredibly well-educated country. There is a middle class. It's small at this time. It's actually probably a lot bigger now. But there is a middle class. There's a significant secular population. There is a significant proportion of moderate religious figures. But as I said, the strongest thing that binds the ties of those in the streets together during this period of uncertainty was radical Islam. That proved to be the kind of strongest force to bring together the crowds and eventually usher in an Islamic republic, led at first by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who arrived in Tehran in 1979 and filled the political vacuum after the retirement of the Shah. And we can see in the primary source reading that we had you read for today, the ways in which Khomeini, the Ayatollah, took up some of the ideas of radical Islam and put them into practice in Iran. The government, quote, should transform our educational and judicial systems as well as all the ministries and government offices that are now run on Western lines or in slavish imitation of Western models and make them compatible to Islam, thus demonstrating to the world true social justice and true cultural, economic, and political independence. In other words, we must reject all Western influences in order to build an Islamic state that will be broadly shared. It's worth pointing out one reason this is kind of odd. Iran is primarily Shia Islam, Shiites. Most of the other radical Islamic figures, I believe such as Qutb, but definitely Al-Qaeda, are Sunni. And that creates somewhat of a conflict that in some ways, and so is the Islamic State. In some ways, Iran would be our natural ally against some of these other radical forces in the Middle East if it weren't for what happens during the revolution, which involved the kidnapping of about a little over 100 American diplomats in the embassy who were held for over a year in Iran. And the Iranian hostage crisis really is what shadows all of the contemporary politics of Iranian American diplomacy. That, again, I would argue, not as a political scientist and not as a European historian, that Iran, despite all of its human rights violations and all of its crimes, is much more naturally suited to being a U.S. ally than an enemy, at least in terms of global politics. And it's not even so simple as to say, well, they're against Israel. That is really complicated as well. Speaking of the people we would perhaps want to ally with Iran against, By the end of the 20th century, these ideas take new shape, and they no longer will be linked to individual state actors, but rather to non-state organizations that simultaneously share many of the same goals. A kind of apocalyptic view of Western values and the absolute need to purge first Arab and Islamic territories of those values in order to purify Islam itself and eventually take that ideology elsewhere. And so the Iranian Revolution kind of represents one vision of radical Islam, right? State-based, the creation of an Islamic Republic. This next example, that of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, in some ways better represents the relationship between radical Islam and globalization. Because Al-Qaeda is not limited within a particular state. It is a non-state, international, borderless entity, and still is, despite the fact that it is much weaker today than it was even 5 years ago. So by the end of the 20th century, new conflict begins to take shape. In the 1960s, terrorism was used as a goal, both by Muslims, but also by Christians. You think about conflict over Northern Ireland, for instance, or anti-Vietnam War protests that used violence to get its way. And so those were broadly shared by people of various ideologies, people of various religions. But one thing they all shared in common was that they had concrete political goals, concrete policy objectives. The use of bombing campaign in Northern Ireland was to achieve the union of Northern Ireland with the rest of Ireland. The use of bombing campaigns and anti-Vietnam War protests was to end the war in Vietnam. Clear political policy goals. However, that use of terrorism by the 1980s and 1990s began to recede in favor of a much more diffused use of terror in order to kind of create the conditions for a broader, ideological questioning of everything the West holds dear. That the use of terrorism by the radical groups such as Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, especially into the 2000s, was not aimed at particular policy achievements, and you can kind of get the sense of this in the letter you read, but rather at basically forcing the West to, question all of its values. And so that's why why it's so sad how quickly we are to question democracy and free speech and all that in the wake of a terrorist attack, because it's precisely what they want. In any case, this ideology finds its most prominent and most important adherent in Osama bin Laden, based in Afghanistan during the the Soviet Union's invasion. During that invasion that Dr. Haynes talked about in a couple lectures ago, the United States decided to fund and promote Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen, fighters against the Soviet Union. And in doing so, I'm an American citizen, we laid the seeds for bin Laden's later quest to delegitimize the West more broadly. And Al-Qaeda during the 1990s began a series of attacks on Western, but especially US interests throughout the world as a way of kind of inscribing the illegitimacy of US presence abroad and the degradation of US culture at home, which again, as you can kind of see in the letter. This culminated most obviously, and we've already seen this with Dr. Haynes' lecture, with the attacks on September 11th, 2001, where one could argue the politics of oil and the desire of the US to extend itself abroad and intervene in the politics of other places came home. That the West's willingness to countenance severe inequality in the Middle East and to support authoritarian dictators fed into the view of a corrupted Islam that itself gave rise to a new ideology that culminated in September 11th, 2001. There are actual causes to this conflict, to this attack. It did not just occur because they hate freedom. It is ideological in nature, rooted in the social, political, and economic conditions that fed into the rise of radical Islam beginning in the 1960s. This moment changed the place of the Middle East in global politics. And indeed, the ramifications, it's hard to conclude because they're ongoing. And it's that ongoing nature that I want to briefly address by the end of the slide, or as I wrap up. In response to the attacks of September 11th, the United States first invades the country of Afghanistan, the home base of Al-Qaeda, and then the country of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq in particular has global and globalizing significance. Based on the use of faulty intelligence, used by the Bush administration to justify a war they probably already wanted, the Iraq War and subsequent occupation were poorly planned, and the results have been manifold, complex, and quite frankly, rather terrifying. The invasion of Iraq created the conditions for a new kind of global politics that the Bush administration seemingly was unprepared for. And what I would argue is that the invasion did two things. It removed a brutal dictator in Saddam Hussein, and it also removed a major balancing force in the region, creating the unstable conditions that feed into the contemporary politics of today. Indeed, one can argue, back to my point about Sunni and Shia Islam and the relationship of Iran, Iraq is a Shia majority state, but during Saddam Hussein's rule, it was run by Sunnis, right, the Sunni minority. And that is no longer the case. Iran and Iraq used to be enemies. With the fall of Hussein, Iraq is essentially a client state of Iran. The elimination of a strong Sunni state there, a Sunni-ruled state, fed into the rise of a new Sunni organization, known as the Islamic State. So the removal of Iraq as a kind of balancing force there created the conditions for the instabilities and the place of Iran in the first place today. And this continues today. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a major threat. And one reason Iran is such a major threat is that Iran is expanding to where we invaded. Israel feels the same way. Israel feels that Iran is an enemy, and Iran's power is expanding because of the instability that emerged in the wake of the invasion. I was just reading a piece, actually in the American Conservative, that was talking about the ways in which Israel and Iran were treating Syria as essentially a proxy war, right, and fighting one another. That said, and I have another side of the Islamic State, I don't want to imply that the results of the invasion, the instabilities that came about, were all negative. A lot of them were negative. And I think full disclosure, if you ask me whether I think the invasion was good or bad, I'm going to say bad. But instability also provides the conditions for other kinds of results. And we saw the possibility of what could come about as these authoritarian regimes felt much more insecure in the wake of the invasion with the Arab Spring of 2010-2012. The Arab Spring was a series of popular revolts that began in Tunisia and then spread across the Middle East. They were led by ordinary people. In Tunisia, they occurred after a man self-immolated, committed suicide by burning as a form of protest. And in its wake, vast amounts of people enter the public square and demand change. Rather than turn to radical Islam, although that was part of what was happening in some of these places, they want to turn, it seems to me, somewhat of a layman, to democracy. So think the problems that were created by the US involvement during the Cold War created severe instability and authoritarian rule. One solution was radical Islam. Another solution is popular protest. Now, unfortunately, it's only Tunisia, really, that we see a successful outcome. That the fall of the Tunisian authorities in the wake of the Arab Spring has led to democracy in Tunisia, from what I understand. And again, I would want to look a little more detail to know more clearly. However, the fall of the authorities in Egypt simply led to a new dictator. The fall of the authorities in Syria has led to civil war. The fall of the authorities in Libya, also civil war, and I would, in some ways, failed state at this point, due, it's worth pointing out, perhaps, to another American intervention under the Obama administration. And Yemen is currently being used as a pawn in various games by Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia. So it is worth emphasizing the possibilities of popular protests in the wake of the instabilities of the post-September 11th world. But it's definitely worth emphasizing that ultimately that's not what has happened. That what has happened has been increased violence, increased radicalization, and increased chaos in the Middle East. So here we have the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, that essentially emerged from all the reasons I've already pointed to. I want to conclude, however, ISIS in many ways, first, I keep telling, I was telling someone that every time I give this lecture, it gets darker and darker. That 3 years ago I gave it and I ended with the Arab Spring. Then 2 years ago I ended it with ISIS, with this chart. And now I have to end it here, with the Syrian civil war. In the course of the Arab Spring, a popular movement took place in Syria that deeply challenged the ruler of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. But unlike in Tunisia, Assad refused to step down. And what emerged was what is now a 7-year and ongoing civil war, which it looks like the rebels are going to lose. The civil war has killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians, caught up in a war that they have no control over. Assad has used chemical weapons against his own people, and the chaos of the civil war had allowed for a time, it's a little better now, ISIS to gain a foothold in Syria. The Syrian civil war has led to millions of refugees. One estimate says that 10.9 million Syrians have been displaced, 3.8 million have been made refugees, which has destabilized the domestic politics of both Europe and the United States, which we see in the recent elections, both there and here. Worth pointing out that the United States, one of the main superpowers involved in all of this, has resettled about, let's see here, about 18,000 Syrian refugees. Note again my previous number, out of 11 million displaced and about 3.8 million who fled the country. And this year we have resettled a total of 11. And the citation for that number, if you want to confirm that that's not fake news, is NPR. So I leave you with that. Happy note. Good luck studying for your exam.